A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of My Weird Prompts. I am Korn, and I am sitting here in our living room in Jerusalem with my brother, looking out at a world that feels increasingly complicated.
Herman Poppleberry, at your service. It is good to be here, Korn. We have a lot to dig into today. Our housemate Daniel actually sent us a prompt that has been sitting on my desk for a few days, and I have been itching to get into the research because it touches on something that most people think they understand, but almost nobody actually sees the full picture of. It is about the sheer, mind-bending scale of the largest country on Earth.
It is the classic problem of the map versus the territory, right? When we look at a map of the world, there is this massive sprawling entity that takes up 1/8 of the entire land surface of the planet. It spans 11 time zones. It looks like this indestructible, monolithic block of purple or red or whatever color your atlas uses. But Daniel wanted us to look beneath that map. He was asking about the internal fragmentation of Russia. Is it really one country? Or is it a collection of disparate pieces held together by a very tight grip in Moscow?
That is the perfect way to frame it. You know, we were talking about global conflict back in episode 645, and we touched on the geopolitical posture of the Russian state. But today, I want to look inward. We are sitting here in March of 2026, and the internal dynamics of that landmass have changed more in the last 4 years than they did in the previous 40. There is this irony where the country is so large that most of its citizens have never seen more than 5% of it. Imagine living in a place where your neighbor is 10,000 kilometers away, yet you are told you share the exact same destiny.
That is a staggering statistic. If you live in Vladivostok, Moscow is essentially a foreign land that happens to speak your language and take your tax money. It is closer to Tokyo or Seoul than it is to the Kremlin. So, where do we even start with this? Do we start with the geography or the people?
I think we have to start with the current reality of isolation. Since the massive sanctions and the closing of Western borders, Russia has seen this incredible domestic tourism boom. In the first 9 months of 2025 alone, there were 69 million domestic trips recorded. Now, on the surface, the state media loves this. They say, look, our people are discovering the beauty of the motherland. But what it actually does is force people from the wealthy centers of Moscow and St. Petersburg to finally see the regions they have ignored for decades. And let me tell you, what they are finding is not always a unified cultural experience.
Right, because you are not just traveling to a different city, you might be traveling to a different civilization. We are talking about 83 federal subjects and 21 ethnic republics. And while ethnic Russians make up about 71% of the population, that remaining 29% is spread across some of the most resource-rich and strategically important areas on the planet. That 71% figure is also a bit misleading, isn't it? Because it masks the 195 distinct ethnic groups living within those borders.
And that is where the friction starts. You have this Moscow-centric narrative that everything is fine, everything is unified. But the FSB, the Internal Security Service, is clearly terrified of the opposite being true. Just recently, they designated over 172 groups as extremist. Many of these are linked to something called the Free Nations of Post-Russia Forum. These are not just fringe activists on the internet anymore. These are movements that represent real regional grievances, from the Ural Mountains to the shores of the Pacific.
It is interesting that you mention the FSB being scared, because you would think a state that powerful wouldn't worry about a few regional groups. But when you look at how the war in Ukraine has been prosecuted, it has been a very lopsided burden, hasn't it? That has to be fueling the fire.
It really has. If you look at the casualty rates and the mobilization numbers as of early 2026, the burden has fallen disproportionately on ethnic minorities. We are talking about the Buryats, the Yakuts, the Chechens, and the various groups in the North Caucasus. In places like Buryatia, near Lake Baikal, the resentment is palpable. Regional officials there have even had to publicly acknowledge and fight what they call separatist threats. When your young men are being sent thousands of miles away to fight for a central government that barely provides basic infrastructure in your home village, the concept of the Federation starts to feel very thin.
I want to dig into that infrastructure point for a second. We think of Russia as this modern state, but isn't it true that the connectivity between these regions is actually quite fragile? If you wanted to go from one side to the other, you are basically looking at one main artery.
You are talking about the Trans-Siberian Railway. It is 9,289 kilometers of track. It is the longest railway line in the world, and for much of the country, it is the only thing that works. It is the lifeline. If you are in a town in central Siberia, your entire connection to the global economy and the national capital depends on that one line. There is no great highway system that rivals the American interstate. There are parts of the Russian Far East where the roads are essentially seasonal. They are frozen or they are mud.
So the Great Russian Road Trip that Daniel was asking about is less of a fun vacation and more of an endurance test?
Oh, it is an absolute odyssey. If you were to actually try to drive from St. Petersburg to Vladivostok, you would be crossing landscapes that are so different they might as well be different planets. But before we get to the travel aspect, we have to talk about the cultural erosion that is happening right now. In 2026, we are seeing the results of federal laws that made the teaching of regional and minority languages non-compulsory. This is what many activists call enforced Russification.
Wait, so if you are in Tatarstan or Sakha, you don't have to learn your ancestral language in school anymore. That seems like a direct attack on the identity of those 21 republics.
It is worse than that. By making it non-compulsory, the central government is effectively signaling that these languages have no future in the professional or political world. They want a single, unified Russian identity to make the country easier to manage from a central office in Moscow. But that creates a pressure cooker. When you try to erase someone's language while also taking their resources and their sons for a war, you are not building unity. You are building a reason for them to want out. The FSB is tracking these groups because they know that identity is the one thing you can't fully suppress with a tank.
That brings up a point we discussed in episode 836 when we were talking about the Bering Strait. The people living on the edges of the empire often have more in common with their neighbors across the water than they do with the bureaucrats in Moscow. But Herman, let's look at the actual map of a potential journey across this space. If someone wanted to understand the diversity of the country, where would they start?
If you want to see the first major crack in the monolithic Russian narrative, you go to Kazan. It is the capital of Tatarstan, and they often call it the third capital of Russia. It is a fascinating place because you have the Kazan Kremlin, where a massive Orthodox cathedral and a stunning blue-domed mosque stand almost side by side. It is a blend of Slavic and Turkic culture that has existed for centuries. It is a reminder that Russia has a deep Islamic history that is often ignored in the West.
And Kazan has historically been one of the more autonomous regions, right? They had their own president for a long time until Moscow forced them to change the title.
They were the last holdout. That tells you everything you need to know about the power struggle. Moscow cannot tolerate even the symbol of regional sovereignty, but Kazan is wealthy. It is a tech hub, it has oil, and it has a very strong sense of self. If you move further east, you cross the Ural Mountains, which everyone says is the border between Europe and Asia. But the real change happens when you hit the West Siberian Plain.
This is a huge area of misconception for people in the West. We tend to use the word Siberia to describe everything east of the mountains. But that is not technically correct, is it?
Not at all. Siberia is a specific geographic and cultural region. It is the heartland. And if you are on this hypothetical road trip, your next big stop would be Novosibirsk. It is the capital of Siberia and the third largest city in the country. But the most interesting part is a suburb called Akademgorodok.
The town of academics. I have always loved that name. It sounds like something out of a science fiction novel.
Precisely. The Soviets built it in the middle of a birch forest to be a world-class scientific hub, away from the prying eyes and distractions of Moscow. It has this unique atmosphere where high-level physics and biology research happens in a place that feels like a summer camp. But even there, in the scientific heart of the country, there is an independent streak. Siberians often view themselves as tougher, more practical, and more honest than the people in Moscow. There is a saying that God is high above and the Tsar is far away. In 2026, that distance feels greater than ever.
That independent spirit seems to be a recurring theme the further you get from the center. I remember reading about Irkutsk and the history of internal exile. That has to play a role in the local culture, right?
It is foundational to the Siberian identity. Think about the Decembrists in the 19th century. These were aristocratic revolutionaries who were exiled to Irkutsk. Instead of just fading away, they brought education, art, and a European intellectual tradition to the middle of the taiga. They built these beautiful wooden houses with intricate carvings that you can still see today. Irkutsk feels like a frontier town that decided to become a center of high culture. It is also the gateway to Lake Baikal, which is a world unto itself.
Lake Baikal is the deepest lake in the world. It holds about 20% of the world's fresh surface water. That has to be a massive draw for that domestic tourism boom you mentioned.
It is the crown jewel. But here is the thing, Korn. When you get to Baikal, you are entering the territory of the Buryat people. If you go to the city of Ulan-Ude on the eastern shore, the vibe shifts completely. You are no longer in an Orthodox Slavic world. You are in the center of Tibetan Buddhism in Russia. You have the Ivolginsky Datsan, which is this beautiful, colorful monastery complex. The faces are different, the food is different, and the spiritual life is different. This is where the fragmentation becomes visible. You realize that the Russian flag flying over Ulan-Ude is a political statement, but the cultural reality is much closer to Mongolia.
And this is one of the regions you mentioned earlier that has been hit hard by the mobilization. It must be a strange tension to be in a place that is so spiritually focused on peace and Buddhism, while being one of the primary sources of manpower for a brutal conflict.
The tension is extreme. And the more people from Moscow visit these places on their new domestic vacations, the more they realize how neglected these regions have been. They see the lack of gas infrastructure in villages that are literally sitting on top of the world's largest gas reserves. That creates a different kind of friction. The Muscovite tourists feel guilty or shocked, and the locals feel resentful that their resources are being used to pave the streets of Moscow while they still use outhouses in the winter. It is a classic imperial relationship, and in 26, the mask is slipping.
So, as we move past Lake Baikal, we leave Siberia and enter what is officially called the Russian Far East. What is the distinction there? Because I think most people just lump it all together.
This is a point I really want our listeners to get. Siberia is the middle. The Far East is the Pacific Gateway. When you get to Vladivostok, you have reached the end of the line. It is 9,000 kilometers from where you started. Vladivostok is a fascinating city because it is built on hills overlooking the Golden Horn Bay. It looks a bit like San Francisco or Istanbul. But the reality there is that China and Japan and the Koreas are the primary influences.
It is closer to Tokyo than it is to Moscow.
Much closer. For decades, the cars in Vladivostok were almost all right-hand drive because they were imported used from Japan. Think about that. You are in a country where you drive on the right side of the road, but everyone in the Far East is sitting on the right side of the car because the local economy is entirely integrated with the Pacific Rim, not the Russian interior. Moscow has tried to crack down on this for years to protect their own car manufacturers, but the people in Vladivostok fought back because the Japanese cars were just better and cheaper.
That is a perfect example of the practical fragmentation. The economic gravity of the Far East pulls toward Asia, while the political gravity pulls toward Europe. In a world of increasing sanctions and isolation from the West, does that make the Far East more important, or does it make Moscow more nervous about losing control?
Both. It makes the Far East the essential lung of the Russian economy. It is how they get goods from China and how they export their oil and coal to the Asian markets, but it also makes the region more autonomous in its thinking. If your prosperity depends on your relationship with Beijing rather than your relationship with Moscow, your loyalty starts to shift. We are seeing this in the way local governors in the Far East have to balance the demands of the Kremlin with the needs of a population that is increasingly looking toward the Pacific.
So, Herman, if we look at this whole picture, we have a country that is trying to enforce a unified identity through language laws and central control, while the actual lived experience of its people is becoming more regionalized. People are traveling more internally, but they are seeing the gaps and the inequalities. The war is putting a strain on the ethnic republics. Is this sustainable? Can a state this large and diverse survive this level of hyper-centralization?
That is the multi-trillion-dollar question. History suggests that when an empire centralizes too much while the periphery feels neglected and exploited, something eventually gives. We saw it with the Soviet Union in 1991. The difference now is that the technology of control is much more advanced. The FSB has tools for surveillance and suppression that the KGB could only dream of. But you cannot surveil your way into a unified national spirit. If the only thing holding the country together is fear and a single railway line, that is a very brittle structure.
It feels like the domestic tourism boom might actually be a double-edged sword for the Kremlin. They wanted to boost the economy and show off the country, but they might have accidentally started a process where the different parts of the empire are finally talking to each other and realizing they all have the same complaints about the center.
It is a catalyst for internal cultural exchange, but that exchange is often full of friction. When a wealthy family from St. Petersburg goes to a resort in the Altai Mountains and treats the local staff like subjects of the empire, that doesn't build national unity. It highlights the class and ethnic divides that the Soviet system tried to paper over with the idea of the Soviet man. Now that the Soviet mask is gone, what is left is a very old-fashioned imperial relationship.
So, for our listeners who are trying to make sense of the news coming out of that part of the world, what should they be looking for? Beyond the headlines about the front line or the latest speech from the Kremlin, what are the indicators of regional stability?
There are three things I always watch. First, look at the regional budgets. Are the regions being allowed to keep more of their tax revenue? Or is Moscow vacuuming it all up to pay for the war? If the money stops flowing back to the regions for basic services, that is where the real unrest starts. Second, watch the language laws and the education system. If there is a sudden pushback or a surge in underground language schools in places like Tatarstan or Sakha, that is a sign of a growing identity movement.
And the third?
The third is the logistics. Watch the Trans-Siberian and the major ports in the Far East. If there are disruptions there, whether from labor strikes or infrastructure failure, the entire country can be paralyzed in days. The vastness of Russia is its greatest defense, but it is also its greatest weakness. You cannot have a modern, centralized state if you cannot reliably move people and goods across 11 time zones.
It really brings home the idea that Russia is not a monolith. It is a collection of distinct, often suppressed, regional identities that are all currently being tested by the same historical forces. If you want to understand the future of that landmass, you have to look at Kazan, Ulan-Ude, and Vladivostok just as much as you look at Moscow.
And you have to understand the historical context of internal exile that we mentioned. Those independent-minded cultures in Siberia didn't just disappear. They are part of the DNA of the place. If you are interested in that specific history, we actually touched on some related themes in episode 8036 when we talked about life on the Bering Strait. It gives you a sense of just how remote and self-reliant these frontier communities have to be.
That was a great episode. It is hard to wrap your head around the fact that you can be in a part of Russia where you are physically closer to the United States than you are to your own capital city.
It changes your perspective on everything. And that is what we try to do here on My Weird Prompts. We want to take these massive, complex topics and find the human and geographic realities that the big headlines often miss.
I think we have covered a lot of ground today, literally and figuratively. From the mosques of Kazan to the Buddhist temples of Buryatia and the Japanese cars of Vladivostok. It is a reminder that the map is just a starting point.
It really is. And I want to thank Daniel for sending in this prompt. It was a deep dive that I think was long overdue, especially given everything that has been happening in 25 and 26.
Definitely. And hey, to everyone listening, if you're finding these deep dives helpful, or if they're sparking new questions for you, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find the show and join the conversation.
It really does. We love seeing the community grow. And if you want to make sure you never miss an episode, you can follow us on Telegram. Just search for My Weird Prompts and you will get a notification every time a new episode drops.
You can also find our full archive, including the episodes we mentioned today, at myweirdprompts.com. There is an RSS feed there if you prefer to subscribe that way, and a contact form if you have a weird prompt of your own that you want us to tackle.
We are always looking for new angles and deep rabbit holes to explore, so don't be shy.
Well, I think that is a wrap for today. This has been My Weird Prompts. I am Corn Poppleberry.
And I am Herman Poppleberry. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you in the next one.
Take care, everyone.
So, Corn, do you think you could handle that 9,000-kilometer train ride?
Only if I can sleep for at least 7,000 of those kilometers.
Spoken like a true sloth. I think I would be staring out the window the whole time, taking notes on every single bridge and tunnel.
I believe it. But seriously, the scale of it is just mind-bending. When you think about the sheer amount of empty space between those hubs of civilization, it is no wonder the central government is so obsessed with control.
Nature hates a vacuum, and empires hate an ungoverned space. But in a place that big, the space is always going to win in the end.
That is a deep thought to end on. All right, let's head out.
Sounds good.
Thanks again for joining us, everyone. We really value your time and your curiosity. It is what keeps this show going.
It really is. We will see you next time.
And goodbye.
Bye.
One last thing, Herman. Did you see that report about the new high-speed rail proposal they are talking about for 27?
I did. But given the current budget constraints, I will believe it when I see the first spike being driven into the ground. They have been talking about high-speed rail between Moscow and St. Petersburg for decades, and it still isn't fully what it was supposed to be. Trying to do that across Siberia is a whole different level of engineering and finance.
True. The permafrost alone makes everything 10 times more expensive and difficult.
You are building on ground that is literally moving as the climate shifts. It is a logistical nightmare.
Well, maybe that is a topic for a future episode. The engineering challenges of the Russian North.
I would love that. There is some fascinating stuff about how they build foundations in the Arctic that I have been wanting to talk about.
Add it to the list. All right, for real this time. Thanks for listening, everyone.
See ya.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My